Hi you guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you love makeup and you love true crime, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you want to see next. If you have any special requests, go ahead and leave them. I like to do those for you guys. And how are you guys today? I feel like I'm just having just a tough week. It's just like there's just so much going on. I feel like I don't have a break. I don't have a break for myself, but that's just the life, right? When you're a mom and you're hustling and you're trying to do everything. So I just got to suck it up. If any of you guys are having a rough week like me, let's just hope it passes quickly. And then next week, yeah, will be so much better. So I had never actually heard about today's case, or maybe I did I? No, I don't think I've ever heard about it, but I randomly came across it when I was researching one of my other cases. And today we're talking about Mary Flora Belle, who, if you can even call a child this, was an 11-year-old monster who caused a sensation in 1968 when she murdered two little tiny boys. And yeah, the shit crazy. So let's talk about Mary Belle. So Mary Flora Belle was born on May 26th in 1957 in Northumberland, England, to a 17-year-old woman. And her mother's name was Elizabeth Betty McCricket. And not only was she super young, she was only 17, but she was also, well, she worked as a sex worker to get by. And around a year after Mary's birth, Betty married a petty criminal and an alcoholic named Billy Belle, who obviously he wasn't Mary's biological father, but Mary ended up taking on his last name. And together the family lived on White House Road in the area of Scotswood, Newcastle. And White House Street was an area that just had really high unemployment rates and a really large police presence. Like police were always in and out of there, mainly due to calls for domestic abuse issues, drug activity, and sex workers. There were a lot of sex workers in that area. And being that it was a poor area and Betty being a young mom, and Betty mainly being not really interested in even being a mom, like she was not trying to win no awards here. She kept the house pretty filthy and she kind of just let Mary do whatever. I mean, all the kids in the area were out in the streets just doing whatever they were doing. Like they were playing till all hours of the night, like till midnight. So Mary was obviously one of those kids who was just out in these streets. Isn't that like insane? And I even read that kids as young as 2 to 3 years old would be in the streets. 2 to 3 years old, like at that age, they have no idea. They have no concept of what's safe and what's unsafe. You know what I mean? Like, it's insane. That would never happen today. Or at least you hope it wouldn't. But when I was growing up, like, I don't know, your parents just like let you do whatever, you know what I mean? Like when you're really young, my parents like let me do whatever I wanted when I was like a kid. But then as soon as I became a teenager, they were like, no, don't do anything. You're not allowed to go anywhere. So like I said before, Mary's mother was so young when Mary was born that when she was born and the doctors, gave Betty, like showed Betty Mary, when she took a look at Mary, the first thing Betty said was, "Oh, take that thing away from me," which like breaks my heart. Like just like a little baby, they can feel your vibe. You know what I mean? Like if you're being like mean, don't you think they can feel it? Like, oh my God, it makes me really sad. I don't want to talk about it. So because Betty worked as a sex worker, Billy Belle, her stepfather, was the one that looked after Mary majority of the time because Betty would travel for her work. She would go and work the more lucrative streets of Glasgow. So Betty's specialties in her job were strangulations, whippings, and sadomasochism. Yeah. So Billy, although he would later be sent to prison for armed robbery, he was really good to Mary. He was super gentle with her and he really loved her dearly. And this was the complete opposite to how Betty would treat her own daughter. Like when I was reading about this, it genuinely made me upset because, you know, when you read things, your imagination kind of takes over. And when I was just reading about the horrible things that Betty would do to Mary, it's like traumatizing. It really, really, really is. And now I have to tell you guys about it. So reports are is that Betty, she just treated Mary really badly and beat her a lot. And when Mary turned 4, just 4, Betty was like, oh, okay, now you can go to work. So she would pass Mary out to her freaking clients who obviously sexually abused Mary, and they would even pay Betty for their time with Mary. That's just so sick. Betty was just not a good mother, and to be honest, she also wasn't really a good person. She also had bipolar disorder, and she was also an alcoholic. And I think due to all this trauma that Mary was enduring, she actually became a chronic bedwetter, which has actually been known to be linked to children who have had traumatic experiences, and it's just like it's a correlation. So Mary wouldn't sleep because she was so afraid that she was going to wet her bed. And why was she afraid of wetting her bed? Because her mother, Betty, would take her face and rub it in her urine, or she would hang the wet mattress out for neighbors to see and just humiliate Mary. Like, that's her mother. And if that wasn't bad enough, she even tried to kill Mary a few times. Once Mary went to hospital because she accidentally swallowed a bunch of sleeping pills. And when Mary was at the hospital to get her stomach pumped, she told the doctors that her mother gave her a jar of Smarties to eat, like M&Ms. Another incident was when Mary fell out of a 2-story building. And then another time her mother tried to strangle her. Lovely. After falling from that window, obviously, Mary suffered kind of extensive brain damage. And however, it's not been specified whether that brain damage was caused from the fall or due to the abuse that she was experiencing, like from constantly getting hit. The prefrontal cortex of her brain, I don't know why I'm doing that. Is that where it is? Maybe because it's prefrontal. Yeah. Prefrontal cortex. And this is the area that relates to controlled activities and the area of decision making. That area of Mary's was damaged. Betty tried multiple ways to get rid of Mary. One time, she even took Mary to an adoption clinic to give her away. And as they were, coming up to the clinic, they saw a woman who later was determined to be crazy. This lady was coming out of the clinic and she was like sobbing because she's like, they won't give me a baby. Like they won't let me adopt a baby. Yeah, because I think she was crazy. Betty was like, oh, you want a baby? Just take my daughter. Like I was coming here to get rid of her anyway. So here you go, free child. However, luckily for Mary, because who knows what this woman would have done. Betty's sister, Catherine, was actually following them in her car, like following them to the adoption clinic. So Catherine ended up following this woman, this crazy woman, to where she lived and found out her details. And then she basically took those details and then went back to Betty's mother, like their mother, Mary's grandmother, and basically ratted Betty out. Mary's grandmother, Betty's mom, said, if you don't bring back Mary within 2 hours, I'm calling the cops. But this did little to sort of help Betty in any way. She didn't care. She did end up getting Mary back, but then she subsequently kept trying to give her to family and friends. Like she was always giving her away and then taking her back and giving her away and taking her back. Like, no, I don't want her, but no, I want her. Like, no, I don't want her. And there was one family member of Betty's who was willing to actually take Mary. Like, let me adopt her. I will take care of her. But Mary, not Betty. But they wanted Mary. But for some reason, Betty just, who knows? Now, can you just imagine how traumatic that would be for Mary? The thoughts, the feelings, the issues, the problems that would have just been accumulating in Mary's mind, her little mind. Her brain was still, developing. If her freaking mother had just been goddamn loving towards her, like, who knows how Mary would have turned out? Or even if her grandmother took her or someone, or if Betty just freaking allowed the people that were actually interested in Mary to take Mary, if Mary would have just had such a different upbringing. She could have been adopted by a family who genuinely loved her, who wanted to take care of her, instead of being passed around constantly and by someone who was just unsure of, wanting Mary. Like, it's just horrible. And as a result of this upbringing, Mary was struggling to make friends. She was struggling to socialize, struggling with her development. And let's just make things worse, Mary ended up becoming friends with a little girl from her neighborhood. But when they were 5, this girl was tragically killed by a bus that hit her in their street while they were playing outside on the road by who knows what time it was. And this all happened in front of Mary. Add that to all the crap that's happened to her in her life, and oh my God. Both at home and at school, Mary exhibited signs of just unpredictable and destructive behavior. She would have sudden mood swings, and she was a chronic bedwetter. She is known to have frequently fought with multiple of her classmates, like boys and girls, and she was known to attempt to, it's not funny, but she was known to attempt to suffocate and strangle them at that age. On one occasion, she is known to have attempted to block the trachea of a young girl by shoving sand down her throat. This violent behavior of Mary's would obviously prevent the other children from wanting to socialize with Mary, but Mary did have one friend. Her name was Norma Belle, and she was 13 years old and the daughter of a next door neighbor. And even though they both had the last name Bell, they were in no way related. According to one classmate in their junior school in 1968, all of Mary's peers had become accustomed to the changes in Mary's behavior. And they knew that when she exhibited certain signs, like when she would have a steely glaze or when she would start shaking, her classmates knew that, okay, right now Mary's about to get violent, and whoever she's about to get violent on is the person that she's staring at. Like, they just kind of knew. So let's talk about Norma Belle. So this was Mary's best friend, and she was 2 years older than Mary. And they were best friends. They did everything together. But although Norma was 2 years older than Mary, Mary was actually the ringleader in the group because she was really street smart. These two girls, they grew up in a neighborhood where violence and crime was just normalized. But even kids who, are accustomed to certain elements, like, even if you grew up in a bad neighborhood and you've never really had much and things like that, even these kids that live like that, they somehow know, without even knowing how they know, that they are missing out on certain elements in life that other kids may have, like, loving parents or just a warm home and like meals on the table or toys and, things like that. They just know that they don't have those things. Parents who pay attention to them, like buying toys and celebrating proper Christmases, not getting hit, and they know they're missing out on it and they're angry about it. They don't even know how, they don't even know why, but they're angry about it. And I get it. Wouldn't you be as well? So Norma, due to this, she regularly took out this anger that she was feeling on the playground, and she would normally do so with her fists. Norma was known to be a bully, and these two little girls, they bonded over all the issues that were going on in their life. And the scary thing is that they bonded over hate. And the two of them became just a really disturbing team. So one day on 11th May, Mary and Norma took a 3-year-old little boy from the neighborhood out to get some candy. And his name was John. And a little while later, they bring little John into a local pub. And when they bring him into the pub, everyone notices that John, he is bleeding from his head. And when, they ask Mary and Norma what happened, they tell everyone that, they found him lying on the ground and they saw him fall from this ledge. The police and an ambulance were called, and John, he made a full recovery, and Mary and Norma were just never questioned any further about this. The next day, while they were at daycare, they were playing in the playground, and 3 girls who were playing in the sand pit were attacked by Mary. During this attack, she strangled 2 of the girls, and then she grabbed the third girl and she sort of held her down and she tried to, like I mentioned before, shove her throat with sand. Like she would physically shove it in there. And what happened was she was initially trying to, I guess, choke her out. But when she realized that wasn't working, she wanted to hurt her some more. So she would grab the sand and just like keep shoving it down her throat, trying to block her throat. Norma happened to be watching all of this and she actually got really freaked out by Mary's behavior. So she jumped up and she started running away. And because of this distraction, the girl who was getting sand shoved down her throat was able to wriggle free and get away from Mary. Now, back then, I don't know what happens, at the school. Like, does she get in trouble? But I mean, given that her mother didn't even care, even if the school had gone back to Betty and said like, hey, this is what your daughter did, like, what would Betty have really done? And this is probably why Mary was able to get away with a lot of this behavior and she continued to do it. Just a couple of weeks later, on May 25th in 1968, there was a boy named Martin Brown, and he was just 4 years old at the time. He lived on that same street with his sister Linda, his mother June, and his father George. And people say he was a super cheeky little guy and everybody loved him. And on that same day, Martin, he wakes up early and the rest of his family stayed sleeping in because it was a weekend, so they wanted to sleep in on the weekends. And it was around 6:30 a.m. So Martin, again, look how different it was back then. This 3-year-old little boy or 4-year-old little boy, he took himself to the kitchen. He ate some cookies and milk. He brings some of those cookies and feeds his little sister Linda through her crib that she was still sleeping in, I guess. And the parents just didn't wake up. They just left their kids. And after feeding his little sister, he just kind of hung around the house, a freaking 4-year-old. He woke his parents at around 9 a.m. And then he just ended up just playing all day, which again, like he woke at 6, then he played till 9. That's 3 hours being unsupervised. What did he do? Like he didn't hurt himself. You know what I mean? This just would never happen today. I mean, do any of you with kids, young kids, let your kids do that? Can you let me know? Because my kid's still really young. So I can't imagine him just even going down the stairs himself. Like he can, but I just wouldn't let him do so unsupervised. You know what I mean? So let me know if your kids kind of just are super independent. So Martin, he plays in the street for the remaining of the day. And then he ends up, like around 3 p.m., he ends up going to his auntie's house to get some coins so he can buy some candy at the local store. And again, I keep saying 3-year-old because I think some places I read he was 3 and then some places he was 4. So I think he was between the ages of 3 and 4. But either way, a 3 or a 4-year-old going to his freaking auntie's house, like where? Down the street, getting some coins for candy and then walking to the local store and buying himself his candy. Like, isn't that crazy? So anyway, later that day, a group of boys, like older boys, they were gathering around these like abandoned houses. And in number 85 on St. Margaret's Road, the boys discovered the body of Martin Brown. And it was just found in one of these bedrooms of these abandoned houses. And Martin was laying on his back with his arms outstretched like he was on a cross. And he was covered with debris and there was blood coming out of his mouth. An ambulance arrived on scene at around 3:35 p.m. and first responders began trying to revive Martin with no signs of a physical struggle, with no further evidence, and there were no visible injuries to Martin's body. The police just determined that it was a tragic accident that went wrong, an accident that involved a boy laying in one of the bedrooms with his arms outstretched like he was on a cross. Like, is that a natural way to die? It just seems strange. And in that area, there was a lot of abandoned buildings due to workers like beginning to demolish the buildings. And then halfway through demolition, they were just like, meh. And then they just like left the buildings there. So the community, they were outraged because they also believed that these buildings were dangerous. And especially after what happened to Martin, they wanted these buildings gone. So on 26th May 1968, Mary celebrates her 11th birthday. And she actually celebrated her birthday with Norma at Norma's house. And while they were celebrating and having this party, Norma's dad, he walks in on Mary strangling Norma's little sister. Like, oh my God, this girl, she's obsessed with strangling people, like obsessed. Norma's dad ends up separating the two girls, but then he's just like, anyway, he like just doesn't think much of it. Like, what the heck? If someone's strangling my child, I'm going to kick you. You know, that doesn't sound like a very good threat, but you know what I mean? Like, how do you just like allow someone to strangle your child? And you're like, no biggie. Like, he just thought they were like fighting or something. And she strangles your kid? Like, that's insane. So the following day, a break-in occurs at their daycare in Scotswood, so the one that Norma and Mary went to. And the nursery was vandalized, and there was like angry notes scribbled all over the walls. And they would only make sense to the police, honestly, when it was too late. And one of the notes that was scribbled on the walls stated, "Fuck off, we murder." Yeah. And there was another a note saying, "I murder so that we may come back." And there was also a confession about "we murdered Martin." And then there were all these like homophobic slurs. So the police were just like, oh, silly kids. That's literally all they thought. They were just like, oh, it's just a bunch of children. They didn't even bother to think that, hey, this could be connected. You know what I mean? Like, they were just like, it's just kids playing pranks. The police were for real like, oh, all these kids dying and stuff. Silly children, just a prank. So while this was happening, Mary, she would actually go to Martin's mother, June, and she would ask her like, oh, how do you feel? You know, now that Martin's dead, like, are you sad? How do you feel about his death? And June was just kind of like, oh, it's just a young girl trying to cope, you know, with the death of a child in the neighborhood. And then she asks June like, oh, can I see Martin? And then June was like, nah, fam, you can't see him because he's dead. Like, he's no longer with us. And then Mary was like, yeah, no, I know. I want to see him in his coffin. And then June was like, goodbye. And then she like slammed the door in Mary's face. 9 weeks later, on July 31st in 1968, Brian Howe was 3 years old, and he was also a resident of White House Street, where Mary grew up. And he was last seen playing that day with his dog in the street. When dinner time rolled around, his parents go out into the street and they call out for Brian, but he doesn't respond. So his family went out into the night and they started to search for Brian. They started like a little search party. But when it seemed that Brian was nowhere to be found, they ended up calling the police. Well into the night, police, people from the neighborhood and the Howe family, they searched for Brian, including Mary and Norma, who were searching throughout that night, who apparently while they were searching, they were like skipping and singing and dancing through the streets searching for him. At around 11 p.m. that same night, baby Brian was found in a wasteland near his home, covered under a blanket of grass and weeds. And unlike Martin Brown, for some reason, it was clear to police that Brian was a victim of a homicide. There was bruising and scratches around his neck and signs that he had been strangled, and scratches all over his face and blood coming from his mouth. So Detective James Dobson was in charge of the investigation of Brian Howe, and he'd also been on the scene weeks earlier when Martin's body was found. So he began putting out like his feelers for child abusers in the area because he believed, well, it's these two little kids, like it must be someone obsessed with children. So the pathologist ruled that Brian Howe had been strangled between the hours of 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. the previous day, and he noted compression marks across the boy's neck and his nose. Brian had been choked and smothered deliberately and carefully, like it was intentional to do it so slowly and to watch this boy die. And the pathologist also found a lot more disturbing things. They found that his hair had been cut, that his legs had been sliced, and an M was carved into his stomach, the letter M. And they also found out that his genitals had been mutilated. Like, what a sick bitch. And the detective noted that the injuries to Brian was not actually like made out of anger. It was more so done in like a really curious, playful way. He said there was a terrible playfulness about it, like almost like a gentle curiosity that was more than terrifying, because what does that mean? The police ended up launching an interview where they interviewed the children of more than 1,000 homes, and Mary and Norma were one of them to be interviewed. The detective says both of them smiled throughout the whole interrogations, and they were just being really, really creepy. Mary recollected that she saw Brian playing, and she actually saw him playing with an 8-year-old boy who then hit Brian. She said when he hit Brian, she saw him playing with this pair of like silver broken scissors, and this boy then attempted to cut a cat's tail with this same pair of scissors. This exact pair of scissors was found really close to Brian's body. Now, that information about the scissors was never released to the public. So the police went and investigated Mary's claims, and they found this 8-year-old boy, and then they also found that that boy was actually at the airport with his parents the day the murder took place, so it couldn't have been him. On the morning of Brian Howe's funeral, Detective Hobson, he ended up going to the funeral, and he wanted to scope out the crowd present and just take note of anyone that caught his eye. And he says this is where he first became truly suspicious of Mary Belle. He recalls her behavior being super disturbing, and at this point, he was just convinced of her guilt. He states that Mary was standing at the front of the Howe residence when Brian's coffin was being carried out of the house, and the detective was obviously watching her, and he said when he saw her, he knew that he was not going to risk another person's life by letting her be free for another day, because what he saw was Mary standing there and laughing and rubbing her hands together. He thought, oh my God, I've got to bring her in. She's going to kill another one. Detective Dobson he made the decision that day that he was going to arrest Mary and Norma. So on 5th August, they went to Mary's home and they attempted to bring her in. And Mary was super defensive, and she even threatened to call a lawyer. Guys, I'm using this new Fenty lip color. What is the shade? It is in Unveil, and I think I kind of love it. What do you guys think? It's more brown in person though. It's pulling a little bit red on camera, but it's super brown. It's like chocolate. So throughout their interview and interrogation, the girls' statements would constantly change, and the police just had to keep chipping away to find out the truth and what really happened. So finally, Norma Belle broke, and she revealed what she swore was the truth. So Norma ends up telling police that Mary had taken Norma to show Norma Brian's body. Mary told Norma how she hurt Brian and how she ran her fingers over Brian's purple lips because she liked it. Police took Norma back to the scene of the crime to see if she was really telling the truth, and Norma got on the ground and laid in the exact same position that Brian was found in, convincing the police that she had in fact seen Brian after his death. She also showed police the exact spot that that pair of scissors that Mary used to mutilate Brian was placed. So she showed them multiple factual evidence, right? She had to have been there. But police didn't believe Norma's claim that she wasn't involved in his murder. And after linking the two boys' deaths, so Brian and Martin together, both girls were charged with their murders, and they were actually charged with manslaughter in August of 1968. And I don't know why it was manslaughter, because it was clearly murder, but it was probably manslaughter because they were so young. So detectives probably assumed that they didn't know what they were doing. During a trial that lasted just 9 days, Mary just seemed really disconnected by what she was being accused of. She was detached from the jury, her lawyers, the judge, just everyone in court. And yet she was also super alert, where she was watching everyone's movement around her. And every adult that was in the court during her trial said that they were extremely disturbed by Mary's behavior in court. And I can imagine just watching this child, while everything's being presented, and her behavior and how she clearly had something wrong with her. It was clear. And the adults in the court said that she gave them the willies. What's the willies, guys? What is that? Mary didn't understand the consequences of her actions, and she didn't realize what was going to happen if she was found guilty, obviously, because she was a freaking child. But she did know what would happen to her if she was found not guilty, and that probably scared her more than anything because she knew that when she got home, Betty was going to beat the living daylights out of her. Most people at the trial believed that Mary was, she was guilty, but they just weren't sure about Norma. They weren't sure if she was just kind of like someone who tagged along or if she actually had something to do with the murders. Mary's mother, Betty, she would just interrupt the proceedings by wailing really loudly, crying, interrupting the court by like going in and out of the courtroom. And basically she was just like storming in and out, trying to probably just get attention, I'm guessing. At this age, Mary's mother, Betty, she was only like 28 years old. And the two girls' behaviors were very, very different in personalities. Mary was bright, she was witty, she was smart, she was sharp. She answered back to counsel with like witty remarks, whereas Norma, she was just not so bright and she was so much more childlike and very quiet. I mean, again, they were only 11 years old at this time. On December 17th, 1968, Norma Belle was acquitted of manslaughter because they believed she was manipulated by Mary into doing the things that she did. And they also believed that Norma didn't really know what she was doing because she just wasn't so bright. Mary, on the other hand, was convicted of manslaughter, but on the grounds of diminished responsibility, with the jury agreeing with the psychiatrists who described Mary as exhibiting symptoms of extreme psychopathy. Mary was detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which is effectively just an indefinite term of imprisonment. The judge described her as super dangerous and that she would most likely definitely cause harm to other people. I read in a blog that most psychiatrists are hesitant to diagnose children as being psychopaths because apparently most young children and adolescents exhibit many signs of being a psychopath, and they fit that criteria because their brains aren't fully developed yet. Their emotions aren't developed. They have a very limited concept of time, other people's lives, and they're very selfish and self-centered. And they don't often understand people's emotions and feelings and the consequences of their actions. And that's not an excuse. It's more so that that's just what research has indicated. They don't understand all of this fully. After her conviction, Mary was the focus of a great deal of attention from the British press. Her mother, Betty, repeatedly sold stories about Mary and would often give writings that she would claim that Mary had written and, letters and things like that. In 1980, at the age of 23 years old, Mary was released from Askham Grange Open Prison, where she served 12 years. Mary was granted anonymity, including a new name, where she was able to start a new life. And 4 years later, at the age of 27, Mary actually gave birth to her first child, her own daughter, and she gave birth to her daughter on her own birthday, so May 26th, which is kind of crazy. And Mary's daughter did not know of her mother's past crimes until the year 1998, when their location was actually discovered by reporters. And Mary and her daughter had to leave their house covering their faces and heads with bed sheets. Since then, they were, forced to move homes multiple times. And finally, in 2003, the courts finally decreed that Mary's daughter should also have anonymity for life so that she can live a normal life. So actually now, any court order in Britain which actually protects the identity of a convict is known as the Mary Belle Order. In 2009, it was reported that Mary had become a grandmother, and I'm not sure if she had any more kids. I'm pretty sure I've only read that she just had that one daughter. And today, Mary Belle is in her 60s, so she's not super old. I mean, 60s nowadays, pretty young considering what she had done in her past. It's crazy that she's still alive, among us. Isn't it crazy that she ended up having a daughter? If she hadn't been convicted and stuff, that cycle of abuse from her mother could have definitely repeated itself. And we don't know if it did, obviously, because her daughter never made any claims of abuse. But if Mary didn't go to prison, most likely she would have just continued this weird cycle because that's all she would have known. Those years in prison probably helped her more than we know because it gave her some type of routine, and maybe she even developed some real friendships, and she was, stopped from having access to do anything crazy. She wasn't allowed to just roam the streets and do whatever she wanted. And given her sadistic urges, who knows what she would have been or turned into as an adult if she wasn't caught. Isn't that insane? It's insane to me. And let me know your thoughts if you disagree with me. But it's obvious that Mary Belle only became Mary Belle because of her disgusting mother and the treatment and the way she was raised. And it 100% affected her. Like, she was traumatized and perhaps acted out in this way as a form of like controlling or inflicting the same pain that maybe she felt as a child onto another child, someone weaker, someone more helpless than her. I mean, clearly it's not normal, the shit that she did, and it's not even something that I would even think of as a child. Like, I wouldn't even think of doing those things. And I think cases like this, like, I like talking about these kinds of things, and people always ask me like, why do you like talking about true crime? Because mentally, and I think a lot of you guys who watch, it's the same kind of thing. Like, mentally you take these notes, and when you're out in the world and when you're doing things and living life, like, it's sort of like in a way protects you, if that makes sense. So like, if I hadn't heard about this case or cases like this or something, another case, I probably wouldn't be as aware as I will be now of my children's friends. Now I'm going to be watching these kids, like, because I feel like, oops, my lash. Because like, I feel like a lot of us are in la la land, and a lot of parents, like, especially us growing up, like, I just remember seeing so many parents and their kids were crazy, wild, and they just had zero clue. They had no idea. We need to watch our own kids. We need to watch our kids' friends, their behaviors, like anything little, and just be aware. Be aware. And I feel like that's what these cases do for me. They just make me much more aware than I maybe would have been. They could be a psychopath in the making. And if only these kids like got some help as a kid, maybe they wouldn't turn into serial killers and we would have just way less crime in the world. Who knows, really? Who knows what the ripple effect could be? Anyways, I'm kind of rambling. So what do you guys think of this case? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I hope you found it interesting. If you want to check out some more, click here. And thanks so much for watching, guys. I will see you in my next video. Besitos. Mwah. Bye.